Delighted to be talking to you today on the theme of empty stomachs, empty minds. We've heard a lot in the news recently from about Marcus Rashford, some of the amazing work he's been doing. There is clearly a huge problem in the UK around poverty and hunger, and we're here to try and unpick some of those issues, challenges, particularly as we get into the festive period. Some of those challenges out there may accelerate. With the world of food has a huge host of challenges and issues at the moment. We're up against it. Big environmental challenges like the climate crisis, health challenges like the obesity crisis, but also social justice challenges, and people not having access to enough culturally appropriate, quality, good food. And food is the thing that binds us together. So what can we do about it? What is the problem? How big is the problem? And how can we come together and build on the momentum that Marcus Rashford and others have harnessed to really tackle poverty and hunger in the UK? I'm delighted today that we're joined by Denise Bentley, the co-founder and chief exec of First Love Foundation based in London, Cara Kennedy, who is a trustee at Rekindle School in Manchester, and Elizabeth Dowler, emeritus professor food and social policy at University of Warwick, who's also a member of the Food Ethics Council. Very good to have you with us today. Let's dive straight in. So with Liz to kick off, what is the problem? If hunger's the symptom, what is the problem, and is this really new?
Okay, thank you, Dan. Okay, the problem is people don't have enough money to be able to buy the food they need to eat. Maybe they live in places where food is more expensive. It often is where poorer people live. But the key thing, of course, is that people who live on insecure incomes because of the nature of their jobs, because they don't have good contracts, they don't have support if they're sick, or if they have other crises. Wages have been far too low. This has been true in Britain for a long time. We are known to have a real problem with low wages. The national minimum wage, the national living wage has been shown to be not enough for people to live on comfortably, not comfortably, even sufficiently, and certainly not enough to buy healthy food on a regular basis and to have any savings for crises. So we've known that for a long time. People get more and more into debt for all sorts of reasons, not least housing problems, and fuel and water costs, childcare, all of these things. And then particularly for those for whom work has not paid off, or they've been made unemployed, or they have difficulties, if they've had to go into universal credit has caused huge problems for people over the last few years. This is very well documented and understood. And it does leave people vulnerable and indebted. Food is where you regrettably can cut back, because you can manage, you think, on nothing much for a week or two. When you have to pay your bills, or you get cut off or thrown on the street, and everything gets worse. But of course, that's been going on for a very long time. I and others have done lots of work on that. There were 4.5 million children living in poverty even before COVID. But COVID has driven, the pandemic has driven a coach and horses through our social fabric. It's made those who are poorer much poorer. Why? Because people who are in secure jobs have found those jobs have become even more insecure. Many people, as we know, it's constantly in the news, people cannot self-isolate. They cannot do what they are required to do, asked to do, because they will have no income. Even people who have been put on furlough, and the furlough scheme has saved a lot of people from falling through the floor. But even many of those who've gone on to furlough were only managing to make ends meet because they did overtime before. And furlough is only 80% of your standard wage. So even many on furlough are more and more in debt, trying to pay for childcare. A lot of people live in crowded housing, or they rely on family to do childcare if they can't pay for it. So all of these problems have been piling up. And as I say, the pandemic has just kind of ripped it open and exposed the inequality within our society. And food has become that touchstone, that marker of real crisis and problems.
And Denise, what about you? What's been your experience? You work on the ground in London. How bad is it, and what impact has COVID had?
Thank you, Dan. It's been absolutely devastating. Tower Hamlets is one of the most deprived areas anywhere in the UK, and of course, the highest levels of child poverty, where nearly 6 in 10 children within Tower Hamlets live in serious poverty. For us, what I certainly said to my team at the very beginning, this is kind of mid-March before lockdown, whatever we do, we will have to feed people, but let's not forget to still look at why they are in poverty in the first place. It's not just COVID. Let's work out, the household income and everything else. And as my team started to speak to people, the problems that Liz has shared came to the fore. There was this tension between food poverty and food access. And so as a quick example, what you had was, let's feed the NHS, they're doing really good work. But I spoke to a single mum of 3 that even though she's on low income, she feeds the children really well. She went to a local supermarket and got into an argument with a supermarket worker because all the food had gone. There were 6 pizzas left, which she'd not normally buy. And she's in a tussle with the shop worker because this is for the NHS. So there's this difference between food poverty, food access, but we saw domestic violence, we saw, attempted suicides. We literally stopped people committing suicide because we were able to get them food and income. But unemployment, the gig economy, digital exclusion, if you don't have a phone, a smartphone that is, you don't have a laptop, how do you manage your universal credit account? We saw all of that and so much more. And I think the thing that really got to me was, children with mental health issues that just increased, family breakdown. And so we just saw this kind of almost toxic cocktail of issues, and the response coming down from government, although I understand why they did it, was just food. Yeah. No one really dealing with the underlying issues that they were going through. So what you have is this kind of this explosion that I think will happen next year and in the years to come, of if we don't deal with the underlying issues and try to restore income and work with these families that are really hard to reach, that are being pushed further down, there's going to be this health emergency, this mental health emergency. And within it all, this is your workforce of tomorrow, which is why I really respect what Cara is trying to do with young people, because if we don't do something now, it's a scary future.
Thank you, Denise. And coming on to Cara then, so what effect is are all these issues having on children and young people? What's your experience, and what do you think? What have you observed yourself?
Thank you, Dan and Denise. Well, as you've both said before, the problems that existed before Corona have just been accentuated by Corona, and the problems we were seeing before were that young people who deal with food insecurity and food poverty have higher levels of stress, higher levels of anxiety. It's harder for them to focus in schools and therefore achieve their potential, especially in younger children. If they're not receiving the right nutrients, then their brain development is behind what it should be. They're not reaching the developmental stages that they're supposed to be at the same time as everybody else, which automatically puts them behind everyone else and puts them at a disadvantage. So we are trying to address that issue at Rekindle by not only providing a different type of education to those struggling in mainstream education where food poverty is one of the factors. We're actually trying to offer a hot and nutritious and most importantly free meal every single night at Rekindle, because if our children and young people don't have that, then it's really hard to address the secondary issues, because how can you deal with everything else on top of being hungry? So that's what we're trying to do at Rekindle. And as we have said and as we have seen, COVID-19 has really, really made problems before much, much worse now. Absolutely. So if we don't do it now, then, like Denise says, we're going to have the same problems later and a lot worse.
And how can young voices aren't often heard in these debates, and they should be? How can young voices, the voices of young people, be heard much more powerfully?
Well, that's a good question. I think I've been lucky. I'm in a very fortunate position to be here and talk about this, but I this isn't an opportunity that is offered to a lot of young people, and it should be. And I think when young people do try to speak out through protests, there's been mass youth protests recently on a number of things, such as the A-level fiasco and everything. last summer, and young people aren't listened to by government, by the MPs who are supposed to represent them. And I think, you know, as charities, we can only do so much, unfortunately, and change does really need to come from the top. And people like Marcus Rashford, young working class voices in a position of power, people like Marcus Rashford have been able to use their platform for good, and it just shows what we can do if we're listened to. And he's forcing MPs to listen now, and I'm really, really happy about that.
Thank you. And I might come back to Marcus Rashford later. It has been a hugely powerful figure, as you've said. Denise, your work at First Love Foundation do work around working with families, an important part of what you do. Why is it important to work at that family level?
Because you cannot solve child poverty just through free school meals. Because all you do is feed that child for the day. But when they go home in the evening, what do they eat? And come the weekends and then inset days before you even get to holiday hunger. But one of the things that we've learned over the years is that as we've worked with families, they don't know what they're entitled to in terms of financial support. So they're literally just surviving from day to day. And I just want, if there is time, I just want to share an example of how what you have is the benefit system, and you've had successive welfare reforms over the years. The one that I feel can be leveraged to help people out of poverty is the benefit cap, and not much is known about it. It's a very complicated system. I'm still trying to get my head around it, but I know that it works. The benefit cap was introduced in 2013, and it's based on the principle that work should always pay more than welfare. That's really why it was set up. And what you've had since 2013 is that the amount of benefits that you can get is capped at £26,000 a year, which is £500 a week. And then in 2016, it was reduced to £23,000 a year. And what that actually means is that, no matter the family size, you can only get £442 a week, and that's in London. The problems come when your rent is, say, £350 or £400 a week or £500 a week, because then you've only got, you've got nil income. And that is a feature that we've seen a lot more of through the COVID pandemic, that people have no income, and so they can't pay their rent, and so therefore they don't have any food to eat. But the way the benefit cap works is that if you work, you actually get all of your entitlement for the benefit cap. And just to give an example, I spoke to a mum yesterday, and I shared her story earlier this year at the Oxford Farmers Conference. And, domestic violence victim, she looks after her children, but also her two siblings, so she's got a family of 5. She's supposed to survive on £442 a week, but her rent is £500 per week. So every month she goes down to the pawn shop and look at what else she can pawn, and she'll borrow money and still be £14,000 in rent arrears. So and it's something that Cara might possibly see with domestic violence victims. Just to give you some context, for the last 16 years she's lived in 37 different properties. So what you've got is destabilization. How can I work? I don't have anywhere to live. And so if she worked part-time, 15 hours a week, believe it or not, it would unlock all that she would get in universal credit. And believe it or not, she would get in the region of £962 a week. And if she worked, she'd get £1,056 a week, which is £50,000 a year. She wants to work. She's got emotional health issues. And actually, more importantly, no one has ever explained to her how the benefit cap works. Yeah. That's a huge problem. I've met hundreds of families, thousands of families, and you ask them what the benefit cap is, they don't know. And she literally said to me yesterday, I was told by my social landlord, if I work, they'll lift the cap. And what's happened over the past year is that the impact on her mental health, not being able to pay the rent, she can't buy the food that she needs. So this is not a unique situation. in the past quarter alone, 170,000 families have been benefit capped. And actually families, it was published in The Guardian last week, families that were impacted by COVID and claimed the benefit that were capped back in March, come next year, all of the restrictions will come in and you'll have even more families that are being pushed down below the bottom line. The solution is really simple. Even though the workplace has changed, why can't we work with business and government to bring in laws or policies that's going to encourage and incentivize organizations to even provide part-time jobs? Because if they do, you won't have many more people like this lady that I've just described that's living on £442 a week, when actually the rules are there for her to basically earn more money. So breakfast clubs, with all due respect, free school meals, with all due respect, and as much money as you'd like to throw at the charitable food experience will not solve poverty. Work does. Maximising income does.
Thank you. And I guess just bringing Liz in here, and having worked and researched this area for a long time, what's your reaction to that, Liz? Would you agree with that? What's your reaction to the kind of work is the answer, getting people into work?
I absolutely agree with what Denise has said. It's a very powerful story. The crucial thing, of course, is that people need work which is secure and which pays a wage which is enough for the family to live on. And those are such crucial problematics. But I also think I agree with what Denise says. Throwing food at the problem is not the answer. Nevertheless, the quick wins are pretty obvious to get Healthy Start functioning properly, holiday food programs and free school meals to expand it so that it works properly. Those should be done just without even having to argue about them anymore. And then we can start to look at these really fundamental, long-standing issues. I think there is such a rhetoric that somehow people who are poor and lazy and don't want to work, nothing could be further from the truth. People are desperate to get jobs, desperate to look after their families. Why should they not be? Anybody wants to do that. We also, by the way, need to do something about child benefit, which was frozen 10 years ago, been increased very slightly, but nothing like enough. That needs to go up by £10 a week. And if people just have that little bit of cushion of money to get them going, then they can really take off proper jobs with good contracts which deal with the lives that we are living. But I also think we need, for goodness sake, some common sense within government to sort out the problems in universal credit and the social security system. That came in. We've just been talking about 75 years since the end of the Second World War, and that was the herald of this new social security system, which was going to prevent want and hunger and destitution people had seen in the 30s. My God, if my mother was alive now, she would be so ashamed of the country which has allowed so many people to go under because the system is not fit for purpose. It needs some sharp, creative, radical thinking to make it work. Thank you, Liz. And we've seen, Marcus Rashford himself was pushing for some of the things you talked about there, Liz. Why, again, coming to Cara, what's your sense about why what Marcus Rashford's been doing has been so important? Why has that resonated with people? Why has it had such a powerful effect? And why is government listening?
Well, Marcus Rashford was on free school meals as a child. That's his whole point about how he would not have been able to be where he is today without free school meals. And the fact that the government couldn't afford 20 million for 1 week of free school meals, but could afford 26 million on a Brexit festival and 12 billion on a faulty track and trace system. I think Marcus Rashford, having his platform and using that to advocate for this has been incredible. And obviously he is in a position of influence as a footballer and as a role model to young people, but he's clearly shown that he is way beyond, what an average football player would do. He's very politically engaged, he's politically active, and he is using his platform for good, as I've said. And I think having people in positions like that from working class backgrounds who know what they're talking about, who have used their experiences to guide them along their careers and along their political activism, that's so important, because to have people like Marcus Rashford who don't look like the politicians in the House of Commons and actually address an issue that they have not done is he's done miles for food poverty, way more than the Tory government has done in a number of years, and that's just one person. So I think having more people like Marcus Rashford and having the support that he has had behind him is what we need to help us deal with this issue.
Thank you. And people talk about sticking fast to solutions here. Some of the things that are being pushed for are quite short term, necessary but short term. How, if we're thinking long term about some of this, and perhaps imagining, do we want a country in a world without food banks? Is the first question.
Yes.
If so, what might some of the long term things that need to happen be in that space? I don't know. Should Denise perhaps come to you first, then Liz?
Sure. How do we live in a world without COVID-19? I keep leaping forward to think about what does a post-COVID world look like. And I agree with Liz, I agree with what Cara shared, but I still come back to we need to kind of create the safety net that allows people to thrive. And we need policies that's going to incentivize people to be employed by companies in this changing COVID world where everyone's working from home, but let's not leave the left behind, that's further left behind, until we can address household income that allows someone to go to the supermarkets and shop like the rest of us do that have an income, then we'll always need food banks. And I also feel there needs to be almost this paradigm shift from, I think that food is a solution to the problem and it makes me feel good because being able to feed someone, listen to their problems, yes, amazing. But ultimately what that person wants is to not have to come to food bank at all. So what you've got is almost the customer of the food bank that don't want to come to food banks, and food banks maybe still wanting to exist. It's going to take a paradigm, systemic, blue sky thinking, what kind of society do we want to see in the future, shift now to be able to say, if we can come together, government, third sector, public sector, private sector, to change the world, then we won't need to have food banks. I want to see food banks go in 3 years. I will not be, that's my promise to you. If it's still there, come shoot me, seriously.
Yeah, I mean,
perhaps not.
No, but it's an important point that we do need some urgency into this, and we need to treat people with dignity. Liz, thinking about long-term solutions, what's your view on things like universal basic income or universal basic services as a platform to allow people to participate? Would that be a sensible move in your view?
It would, and I just want to applaud what Denise has just said. I'm sitting here dancing. I absolutely agree with you. I was going to say 5 years, so 3 years, even more important, good for you. I mean, the truth is, when I started working on food and poverty in Britain, having done it in the Global South 30 years ago, we didn't have food banks. We still had food and poverty, but we didn't have food banks. So there's a really interesting question there as to, whose benefit are food banks for? But maybe that's not what for now. But Dan started by saying we have many problems that we're facing. Climate crisis, AI, artificial intelligence, challenging the nature of work, not just pandemics. And I don't think COVID will be the last pandemic for all sorts of reasons. So we are facing in the 21st century huge challenges for which we need creativity and vision and new ways of thinking, new ways to grow food, locally maybe, in different ways of living, different kinds of housing. We haven't had time to talk about housing, but that's a real challenge for people being able to afford food. I mean, Denise gave us the examples, as did Cora. So I think the way that so many people are talking about things like universal basic income is really exciting. And I think we need to be really getting to grips with that and looking, it'll be a big change. It's a very fundamental, radical thing. But that's what we had after the Second World War. I wasn't alive then, but that was the last time we had huge social change and poverty and amazing, immense challenges to overcome. But society rose up and we had governments that were prepared to listen to people and to take radical steps that were for people's good, for social general good, to challenge inequality and really do the things that make a difference. So universal basic income, as long as it's set at an appropriate level and has appropriate ways to upgrade it and doesn't become an impossible ceiling through which nobody can get, I think is a really powerful idea that we should be absolutely exploring and putting into practice.
Thank you. I want to come in the last couple of minutes. I want to come to in a moment to a positive. It's a very tough and challenging world out there, and for many people. But I want to finish on an optimistic note in a minute. But I guess want to feed in a question from, and I'll let Denise come in on this as well. Feed in a question from the audience, which was around, I guess, the politics of this. Would a change in government, would another government be more sympathetic to this crisis? Is this a problem of politics, or does it go deeper than that? I don't know, Denise, did you want to respond on that briefly?
So over these past 10 years, I've engaged with politicians on both sides. And I think the problem is too big to be able to fall into one camp or the other. I'm prepared to work with anyone. And I found that those that are furthest away from understanding what poverty is often appreciate the opportunity to come sit down and listen to someone for themselves. That's how we've effected change in laws, because I've had a peer of the realm come sit down in my food bank and listen to someone that said they were sleeping in a van. They're fiber optics engineer sleeping in a van in a petrol station with no wheels. And it humbled him to the point where he went back to the House of Lords and said, we've got to do something about child poverty. I think it's about facilitating understanding. I'm happy to work with all the different sides, as long as in the middle of it, they want to see change and bring about social justice. So I think I'm not going to give up hope, because there's another 3-4 years of the Conservative government. But I think that there needs to be this kind of coming together. That's really what I want to see. I don't want to get tribal about this. It's really not about me and what I think.
Great, good stuff. Thank you. A final question to each of you in turn, perhaps starting with Cara, is how can we create change? What's something that we can perhaps do, and or what's a reason to be positive again amidst the gloom? What's sort of some of the hopeful things happening that we can build on? So what should we actually be doing? Cara?
Well, thank you. I think like this coming together and, from all different parts and of dealing with food poverty and talking about this issue and addressing this issue and looking at ways forward, that is the first step. So more things like this, firstly, but definitely, like Denise says, a collaboration between the public sector, the private sector, government, everything, because we can't solve this as one or the other. We have to solve this together, and that includes government, that includes young people, that includes people like Marcus Rashford, and that includes the politicians and the people sitting in the House of Commons. So definitely more collaboration and definitely more real talks about how this is impacting us and how we can move forward from this.
Thank you. Liz, same question to you. What should we be doing, and what's the reason for hope?
I absolutely agree with what's been said. I think our reasons for hope are so many people in this country and elsewhere who are very shocked by what's going on and passionate and wanting to do something about it. Fantastic. Let's listen to creativity. So find out stuff, talk to your neighbours, talk to lots of people, and write to the decision makers, not just MPs, but also your local authorities. There are lots of councils, we haven't mentioned them much, who are desperately trying to do things, and they need to know that they have the support of the people who vote them in. I think we have to show that solidarity in really practical ways. And I just wanted to add in to what Denise had said earlier. There are other countries, dare I say, in Europe, who have faced huge problems from COVID as we have, who don't have the food bank levels that we do, who don't have the inequalities that we do. So there are things to learn from elsewhere.
Thank you, Liz. And final word to Denise again. What needs to change? What can we do?
Coming back to my point about this almost stakeholder approach that Cara and Liz has touched on, I'm encouraged by the contact we have with corporates who are starting to think about corporate social responsibility in a different way, moving beyond volunteering into tell me what it is that you want me to do. And so I think if we can start having that conversation about part-time jobs and using this system of benefit cap Like, you don't have to redesign, it's there, it works. Let's use that to help lift people out of poverty and take a more holistic approach to solving poverty. So that's what gives me hope for the future.
Brilliant, thank you. It's great to finish on a positive note. Well, a big thank you to Denise, to Cara, and to Liz for your brilliant insights today. It's a massively complex issue. We've scratched the surface, but I guess, you know, we can and must treat people with dignity, empower people so everyone can participate and shape that fairer food system that we all want.